Why am I a Christian? I started thinking this would be an interesting question to ask. I mean, it's so central to my life, and rarely, if ever, have I tried to answer it. The only time I could think that someone specifically asked me was in conversations with an atheist friend, and I got very defensive. And it kind of struck me as odd. Why did I get defensive about that? And I think the reason is because some of the truth of why I'm a Christian, I felt at the time, weakened the case for the veracity of why I was a Christian. I now no longer think that because I've had time to think about it. And I want to give you the reasons why I'm a Christian. And I want to be really honest with you. Some of them may be things that people wouldn't want to admit, but I'm just going to admit them to you and see what happens. So I heard once that 30% of people leave the faith of their parents. And the person who was telling me this thought that it showed how weak the ties of faith were. But what I heard in it is 70% stick with the faith of their parents. 70%? That's pretty amazing. And sometimes a statistic like this is shared to make the point that you're only a Christian because you were raised in it. And so I just want to admit that for a lot of my life, that was the truth. I was a Christian because I was raised in it. And that still continues to have some sway in my life. I would say, though, I no longer am a Christian just because I was raised in it, but it does play a part, right? For a long time, I wondered if I might have just stayed in the faith because early on, at like 16, for instance, I was already leading a Bible study in my parents' garage in high school, and was in ministry early on, in churches as a young man, and was getting comments like comments that led me to realize that I had a kind of an unusual skill for explaining the Bible that was not common. And so I got a lot of affirmation. I got a lot of really positive feedback, and my entire kind of identity got wrapped up inside of being kind of a Bible teacher, a young, skilled Bible teacher. And so I wondered for a while if that actually might be why I stayed in the faith, was because I was getting a lot of affirmation. And so that's a challenge that a lot of people face who are very talented and find affirmation in the church. We've seen so many young ministers and writers and Christian musicians who got famous young. I wasn't famous, by the way, but there's those who got famous young, and they begin a career as a very young person in ministry, and then they're kind of stuck in a way. And later in life, they then begin to question, and then it's a huge burden to bear that they have to do that publicly, because now they're a public figure. Luckily, I wasn't a public figure. I had some affirmation from the churches and the ministries that I worked with, but I wasn't a public figure, and I'm glad I wasn't. And so I wondered that for a while, but then I quit ministry, and I quit ministry for about 8 or 9 years, I think. And I never completely stopped going to church, but I pulled out of being very involved in any particular church. I got married in that time, and had a video business. Had some huge clients. Did a project once for the Independent Film Channel, a South by Southwest shoot. Had some other projects that were huge clients, but they were secular. They were secular clients, and so what I experienced in that time was seeing people striving, working really hard toward a goal, but it was ultimately like a humanist goal. It was a goal that was ultimately pretty empty. And so there was a kind of emptiness in the world outside of, working in ministry. And that was, I don't know if that was a surprise, but it was a challenge. And so I pursued success in filmmaking and with my media business. And, fortunately, a lot of the clients I had were ministry clients. And so I was able to kind of maintain some connection with discussions about ministry and Jesus and the faith. So I wasn't completely removed, but I was removed enough that I could have left the faith at that point. Now, I'm not saying that I wanted to or that I had planned to, but I was not as close to the Lord in that time. And I was growing bitter. I found it difficult to sit in church. I had a lot of bitterness in that time, a lot of frustration, a lot of anger. I think a lot of it might have been jealousy because I was remembering those days when I had been on stage, teaching the Bible or playing music, and I was watching other people get their enjoyment and their fulfillment from serving in that way. And I think I felt jealous, and I think that led to bitterness. And so it was hard for me to sit in church. It was frustrating. And I also had a pretty big theme in my life at that time of pursuing some sins, some internet sins, pornography, and stuff like that. And so, because of that, was growing kind of a hardness of heart. I think would probably be the best way to say it. I was feeling bitter. I was trying to justify that sin and make that sin okay, and that actually led me to being more open to some of the, I'll say, ideas outside. Never abandoned the faith, or anything like that. But I felt myself kind of drifting. Drifting would be the right word for it. And I'm glad I didn't stay in that. Honestly, my wife was pretty instrumental in um, in offering an opportunity to leave that. Although she didn't force me, but she had a lot of connections in her family and the church where she grew up, and that led to other connections that sort of drew me back into ministry over time, and a ministry that her dad started that I'm involved in now. And so over time, I was drawn kind of back into that. But I had nearly a decade there where I had real freedom to leave the faith if I wanted. Of course, there would have been social consequences, but I could have. I could have, and I didn't. So a lot of that, I think, had to do with the emptiness that I sensed outside. The most successful people that I worked with in my video business, there was often a lot of emptiness if they were people that didn't have faith, and that was meaningful to see. The people that I was kind of idolizing and wanting to be like in filmmaking and in the kind of the media industry, they were a lot more, they seemed like they felt a lot more empty than I did, if they were completely secular or agnostic, atheist, or whatever. So that meant something to me, and I think that did influence me. So I started kind of moving back toward ministry, and I think one way to say it is I wrote down that I stayed because of the deep longing, that spiritual hole in my gut. I experienced it being filled, and that light could still shine through in times when I was drowning in my own sin or my own brokenness or my own weakness. Now, by the way, this is all after I was a Christian. I was a Christian this whole time, but I'd kind of been running and distant. And so it kind of felt like I had spiritual companionship through that whole time, even though I was running. And so in those times, I was actively like justifying my own icky darkness that I was pursuing. But I now think that spiritual companionship I felt that never really left, I now think that was just the Holy Spirit in me doing what the Holy Spirit does. And I'm so thankful for that. And when I would kind of run up against that emptiness, in those years, I never left, right? I never jumped the fence and got outside of the reservation, so to speak. But I got closer to the fences than I had ever been before, and it's like I could hear the emptiness outside or something. It's like the enchanted forest beyond had scary creatures, or something like that. There was an emptiness out there, and I could feel it as I got closer to the edge. And the thing that would drive it away was reaching out to my Creator, reaching out to Jesus, and generally through prayer, sometimes through Bible study. But I wasn't really studying my Bible much, or even opening my Bible much in those years. But I still did pray fairly regularly, and never really left that behind. And so when I would reach out, if I was feeling that emptiness, and when I would reach out to Jesus, it just drove the emptiness away, right? And I know that sounds like woo-woo, stuff, but I don't know how else to put it. And it wasn't like an intense experience, by the way. Some people seem to experience God in a much more charismatic way. I never really have. For me, it's never been all that intense. It's just been consistent, And so like I think God probably interacts with people in different ways. And so just in the same way that I interact differently with different friends, God interacts with us probably different in different ways. And so for me, consistency was more valuable than like really intense momentary experiences. Like I needed that consistency, and that's a lot of what kept me. And so I really can't for those parts, I can't take credit for any of this. I can't take credit for my parents being Christians and raising me in that. That was their credit. But even they probably would say, well, no, that wasn't to their credit. That was God to the credit of God. Same with this kind of drawing that kept me from leaving. That's not to my credit. That was to God's credit. So those are big aspects. But there was more, I think. Another reason I stayed, and this may be one of the biggest ones. I don't know. Another reason that I stayed is that God's people were good. God's people, meaning other believers, were good. The vast majority were very good to me. They were very good to each other, and that was something different than I saw out in the world. Now I know, of course, everyone has these stories of heartbreak of how hypocritical Christians have hurt them and stomped all over them. And there are some of those that does happen. But here's a challenge that I want you to think about. When someone tells you that the church is full of hypocrites, ask this question: how many? And they'll say, well, what do you mean? You say, well, how many hypocrites did you come in contact with in church? And they might initially say, well, all of them. You say, well, no, hold on. Really, how many people are you talking about when you say the church is full of hypocrites? And when you drill down to it, except in rare cases, usually the person has been hurt by one or two people, and then they've taken that and they've kind of blanketed that across the entirety of everyone else at that church that had no idea that it was going on. And so a follow-up question might be to say something like, well, how many people hurt you? And they may say, well, 3 or 4 or 5. Even if it's 5, how big was that church? Well, it was 150 people. So then the question is, how many people didn't hurt you? How many people accepted you? How many people were kind to you? How many people would have had you come and eat with them and share Lord's Supper with you and pray for you? How many people did that? And the fact is, usually it's the vast majority of believers in most churches. So this whole argument of the church is full of hypocrites, I just think it's phooey, it's silliness, and I think we need to challenge it by really not just letting it slide. That's what we often do, is just letting it slide. Like one of my old answers used to be when somebody would say, the church is full of hypocrites, I would say, yeah, because it's the only place that would take us. I think it's a pretty good answer. It's kind of funny. But then you could follow it up with this other idea, because I think it's true. Now, are there churches that lend themselves to hypocrites, self-righteous, legalist, jerks? Yes, there probably are. But that wasn't where I was. At least, I don't think I was. And maybe I was one of them. Whatever. My point is that I didn't leave the faith largely because my experiences with God's people were very good. And my experiences with unbelievers were okay. I mean, like it's still the United States. Everybody kind of has a gist of how we're supposed to behave. But even that comes from being bathed in Christian history over time. So even that, really, Christianity can kind of take credit for, in my opinion. So my experiences with other believers were really good. God's people were really good to me. They were good to each other. They were genuine. They were just amazing. And so this kept me. And by the way, I was hurt by a handful of people over time, but it just didn't. It didn't dictate the norm. It was the fringe. And often when I was hurt by someone inside the church, other people from inside the church who saw it would take action, or would speak against it at least, or encourage me. God's people are good, right? I mean, if you're dealing with other believers, you're gonna it's gonna be better than what's out there. Now, if you're dealing with religious legalists, whole other story. And some people have been hurt by entire groups of religious legalists. I acknowledge that. I'm very sorry if that's happened to you. But that just really, I feel like that was not predominantly my experience. So with that said, that largely kept me in the faith. Yet again, I can't take credit for it, right? That's other people. That's God working through other people. So that's another reason why I stayed. There's another big reason, but when I say big, I think it's actually smaller. There's another reason I stayed that I think is smaller, but it's made to sound like it's a big reason. Lots of people make this into a big issue. In fact, apologetics is kind of based on this whole thing that I'm about to say. But one of the smaller reasons why I stayed is because philosophically, Christianity worked. It works. I'm a very I'm introspective. I'm analytical. I ask a lot of questions. I'm a very curious person. If you meet me face to face, I'm going to be asking you questions. I want to know things about you, but not just about you, but about you. You know, what can I learn from you? Okay, so that's my mindset. If Christianity didn't work philosophically, it would be a challenge for me. I don't know that I wouldn't have immediately left because of these other reasons I've said, but it would be something in there that would make it difficult for me to just be honest about what I think. And maybe I would leave eventually. I don't know, but I don't think I would, probably based on this one. But it is one of the reasons that I stay is that Christianity it works. It's rational. It's reasonable. Some of the ideas there is that it's based on well-recorded public actions. This is what I wrote down about it. Christianity is based on well-recorded. I really do believe that. I think the apostles did a great job of recording what happened. Public actions, I think that's valuable. It's not a secret religion where things were done kind of in the dark in the back rooms where only one or two people saw it and you have to just trust those one or two people. Jesus did stuff publicly. That's a huge deal. He did things in front of large crowds. He appeared after his death to a lot of people. So those became eyewitnesses that then could verify in that, that first kind of Bible writing phase. They could verify that what was being written down and accepted as canonical was actually true, right? It was well recorded. It was public actions, and those public actions would be inexplicable by any other means, in my opinion, other than that our Creator took on a human body. It came to earth to reconcile his creation to himself. That's just the best explanation. It's not the only explanation. Like, he could have been a multi-dimensional alien being, who duped us or something. I mean, there's other explanations. They're just not as good. They just don't work as well. They're not as rational as the very rational explanation that the apostles give in the Gospels and in their letters. So it philosophically works. It fits together. It answers the big cosmology questions. It also has a kind of philosophical flexibility that you would expect of the Creator, because, like, if someone writes a religion right now, like a false religion, they would write it for our times, but they can't predict the mindset of people from the future, and they can't predict the kind of issues they'll be dealing with. And so that makes older fake religions harder to maintain. Christianity has not suffered from that. Christianity has shown this amazing philosophical flexibility through the timeline of history in such a way that it continues to be viable. I mean, that's the amazing thing. We're still talking about what these guys wrote down, and that's because, in my opinion, what they wrote down came from the source of us, came from the Creator. He showed amazing, just amazing supernatural wisdom in the way that he did the whole thing. And so it works philosophically. Now, I know that it's very possible in the comment section, if, like, say, agnostics or atheists are watching this, that there will be bitter hearts that decry the rationality of the faith. They'll say that I'm wrong. They'll say that Christianity is silly and stupid and, all of these things. There's a time in my life when I had some real success with some apologetic videos where I was waking up pretty much every morning with multiple comments cussing me out for what I'd said in those videos. But, I thought, well, I guess it's working if they don't like, if the agnostics don't like, or the atheists don't like what I'm saying. But I mean, for me, I'm just talking for me here. It works, and there's going to be those that say it doesn't. But here's my bottom line on this philosophically it works, is that there is enough evidence to convince a person if they are open-minded enough to give it an honest attempt. Okay, so, like, are there gaps that we can't answer? Absolutely. but there's gaps in physics. There's gaps in cosmology. There's gaps in any of the sciences. There's gaps in dentistry. You see what that's kind of funny. There's gaps that we don't know the answers to, but by and large, not by and large, I just think this is absolutely true, that there is enough evidence. It's not that is there answers for every single thing? Maybe not, but there's enough. And that's what matters, because what we're called to do is to believe, to put our faith in Christ. And so there is enough evidence for an open-minded person to believe. That is just, that's unassailable in my opinion. There's enough evidence. There's not 100% certainty evidence on certain subjects, but enough evidence for a rational person to believe. And lots of rational, intelligent people have believed. And let me just make a note about something on this issue of it works philosophically. So a few years ago, I did a series of surveys focusing on atheists and agnostics, and what I wanted to figure out had to do with these unanswered intellectual questions. Okay, so let me see if I can I've got some notes here, but I'm going to kind of expound on this because I think it's important. A lot of people, a lot of Christians get into apologetics thinking that if they can just give answers to the supposedly unanswered philosophical and intellectual questions, then the atheist they'll see the light, But over and over, as I was kind of doing some apologetics ministry, I kept seeing that wasn't happening. And I thought, what is going on? Why is it that for this person of faith over here, this is a completely rational, completely reasonable argument that works for them, and then you have this atheist person? This is not as common with the agnostics, but it is somewhat present. But it was even more common with those hardline atheists who were very verbal about it, very outspoken. They weren't being convinced, and I thought, okay, well let's do some surveys. Let's see if we can figure out what's going on here. And so I focused on atheists who had grown up in the faith and then left the faith, right? So they'd been self-proclaimed Christians, and then they'd left that faith behind. And so now what they focus on generally when they're debating or arguing or posting memes is what I would call these unanswered intellectual questions. And so what the survey was trying to get at is, when in the process of de-churching did you start asking those intellectual questions? Or when in the process of secularization, like you're on a process, you were Christian, now you're atheist. That didn't happen in one day, it kind of happened over time. And so I asked these Christian turned atheists to analyze that process, like which of these steps happened in which order. And what I found was that the unanswered intellectual questions really came kind of toward the end of the process. What came toward the beginning of the process was that the then Christian got involved in some type of what the church would call sin. Sometimes that might have been sexual sin. Sometimes that might have been, I don't need to list sins. They just got involved in some type of sin. And then that would lead generally to a sense of isolation from other believers. And that isolation would grow and grow and grow. And then bitterness would kind of come in. And then toward the end of that process, when the person is already feeling discomfort and feeling disconnected, that's when the intellectual questions start to come in. Now, are there exceptions to that process? Yeah, of course, there's exceptions to, not everybody said that, but there was enough in the surveys that I realized, yeah, this is a thing. So those intellectual questions come generally toward the end, and here's what became fairly evident to me, is that in a lot of cases, those intellectual questions actually acted as a permission mechanism. And what I mean by that is, especially in cases where there had been a sin that the person was attached to and either didn't or felt like they couldn't leave behind, it grew a great amount of tension inside of their psyche, or inside of their soul, or whatever you want to call it. They had guilt for the sin, and that guilt then became sort of displaced on the other believers around them, and they began to feel bitter for the guilt, and they're trying to look for an escape. I've heard multiple atheists say this. They were looking for an escape from the guilt. And and a way to preserve their own dignity, right? I mean, pride is powerful. And so then the unanswered intellectual questions become a way to permit, to personally permit that person to escape the guilt, at least so they think. And I think that's really where these unanswered intellectual questions often fit, is in this place where the person is looking for permission to do the sin. I mean, I know that sounds old school, but I actually think that is what's going on, is they want permission. And I've had enough atheists tell me that atheists who were really honest about the kind of the round trip, have told me that they wanted, in some ways they wanted Christianity to be true because it's comforting, but in some ways they wanted it to be false because they were living under such tension. And so these unanswered intellectual questions, that set of surveys, for me, it kind of just set them aside. Not to say that we don't deal with them, right? But I started to feel like if that is truly the case, then a lot of apologetics really is probably misplaced. And what we need to be doing is we need to be calling Christians who have gone wayward back to the faith through the traditional means of talking about lifestyle, talking about sin, talking about the hardening effects of sin and how that can lead to disbelief. I mean, Hebrews just straight up says that, right? So we know it in Scripture that this happens, that hardness of heart can come from sin, and then unbelief can come from that. And so I just don't think it's about unanswered intellectual questions. I just don't think those are nearly as powerful as people pretend like they are. And by the way, and here's the other thing, that the unanswered intellectual questions allows the person to preserve their pride, because I don't think any atheist wants to admit, yeah, I failed as a Christian morally, and that led to me being isolated, and that led to me being bitter, and then that led to me looking for a philosophical escape, and then I found it in the... No atheist wants to say that. They often use the supposed unanswered intellectual questions because that's a way of remaining superior. I mean, so like you look at it and it has Pharisee written all over it. It has superiority written all over it. Now, I'm not saying every atheist is in this place, but the very aggressive, outspoken atheist who's, you've heard the script, you know what I'm talking about. Not every atheist is there. Some atheists, they just don't believe. That's it. But those who are aggressive, really, this is kind of, this is what we're dealing with. So apologetics then should be applied to those who have never believed or whose faith never went deep. But I think some of these other folks, really, apologetics is a large flock of red herrings, because I don't want to be spending my time trying to convince somebody about a supposed unanswered intellectual question when there's just going to be another one right after it, and it's not going to change anything. And so it can be pretty hard to determine which it is. Is this person's faith really shipwrecked because of this, or is this an excuse? And I just think a lot of them are excuses. I know that probably feels really flat for some people, but it comes from my experience, and I have a bit of experience. So anyway, feel free to gripe in the comment section if you need to. It's okay. We can handle it. So anyway, that's my thought. So boy, I really rambled there toward the end, but you get a sense of why I am a Christian. Some of it is because of my upbringing, but that's not why I stayed, I don't think. A lot of it has to do with social. A lot of it has to do with spiritual. God gets the credit for it, and I think I laid out exactly why that is. Let me just add this. Another reason why I've stayed is because it's an adventure. I mean, it really is. I know that you think you're having an adventure, but I'm having an adventure. I'm the one having an adventure over here. I mean, some people think, the faith is so boring, but it fills me with such excitement to think about the future, to think about Christ's return, to think about the kingdom, to think about what's to come. And so that's a whole nother one that I didn't write down in my notes over here. It's just occurred to me. Some of why I stay is because I really like it. I'm enamored by the concepts. I'm in love with with what it means, and I'm looking forward to the payout. So I think I'll end with that. I've given you a lot to think about, and I've gone for 35 minutes. That's the length of a sermon. So I guess we'll call it. Thanks a bunch for watching, and feel free to share this or subscribe if it's meaningful to you. Feel free to leave a mean comment if you need to. All right, we'll see you later.